I'm going to talk about the reading from Dr. David Hughes on local media coverage in state Supreme Court elections. And there's sort of two hooks that I want to give this, because one, you might be wondering, why do we care about local media coverage in state Supreme Court elections? Well, if you've watched the previous video 5.2, I asked you if you could name a single one of the 18 judges that sit on the two state high courts of Texas, and I would presume in most cases you couldn't. And so that's why local coverage of these state high court races is increasingly important. And as we know from the article, over time, that local coverage has dried up and in some states virtually gone away. And so we have to think to ourselves, well, how do voters in these circumstances, how do they make a vote choice? And the answers that I can give you based on research in political science is getting as close to it as they can. So the easiest conditions by which to choose a judge whom you don't know is in partisan elections. So when we go to the voting booth here in Texas and we get to a judge race where we don't know the judge, be it state Supreme Court justice or local municipal court, if we don't know the judge, we have the benefit of those judges being listed on the ballot with party identification. So when I come across a judge I don't know, based on party identification, I know which judge I can vote for that would most closely align with my own ideology. And that heuristic is exceedingly useful where partisan elections exist. And so there are 4 states that have partisan elections for both initial selection and retention, and 3 more states that have it as a form of initial selection with variation in terms of retention. So a minority of states actually have these systems, have a partisan election system. A plurality of states actually use nonpartisan contested elections. So what does vote choice look like in nonpartisan contested elections? Well, voters that are informed, voters that do know, can almost always identify the ideology of the candidates based on any sort of numerous sort of heuristics that go into the act of campaigning. One thing we know is that nonpartisan races, generally contested nonpartisan elections, are more costly than partisan elections. And the reason for that, at least part of the reason for that, is these candidates are trying to get their name out there, because we know that name recognition to a fair degree predicts success in these races. But it also is to get their ideology out there. Most of these races are candidate A versus candidate B, and more often than not, based on sort of the way things have always been, these candidates don't say where they stand on issues. But they will say things that make it very, very easy to impute their ideology, to figure it out. But that's for individuals who are tuned in. Individuals who aren't tuned in don't get that information. Individuals who aren't watching, they might get name recognition. They might see a sign on the side of the road on voting day and remember that individual's running for judge. But that's not figuring out what that individual's ideology is. And that doesn't mean that the vote choice of that individual is going to actually be choosing the quote unquote correct candidate that would best represent themselves. Nonpartisan races are harder, which is why they spend more money. In retention election races, and I sort of bat an eye at even calling them races. These aren't races. We think of elections as candidate A versus candidate B in the United States. These retention elections are candidate A versus themselves. And there is no one else running. These are not contested. This is, do you approve of the job that Justice Gonzalez did in the past year? Now, here's the thing. These judges in retention election states, more often than not, don't campaign. They don't raise money. If they do, they put out flyers or signs on the side of the road. But they're not running television ads. They're not having to combat another candidate. They're not having to do any of that. And that's because largely the default position of most individuals when faced with the question of, do you approve or disapprove of the job this judge did? And you don't know who that judge is. The default condition is, well, they must not have done anything bad or else I would have heard of them. Therefore, I approve of the job they're doing. We know that outside of exceedingly rare circumstances, judges in retention elections are overwhelmingly retained. I would have to go back to Iowa in 2006 to point to a circumstance where judges were removed in retention elections. And there were 3 judges on the Iowa State Supreme Court that were removed. And they were removed in part because they legalized gay marriage within the state. From 2006, I would have to jump back to the 1980s to point to, I think, 3 judges in California, 3 state Supreme Court judges in California who were removed, including the Chief Justice of the state. And they were removed for their opposition towards the death penalty. Now, outside of circumstances like that, it would be very hard for me, minus a scandal, to identify state Supreme Court justices who were removed via retention elections. The default mechanism is simply approve these judges. Even if they're ideologically out of step with the public, approve these judges. And so newspaper coverage in all of these contexts can be exceedingly helpful to voters. Because if local newspaper coverage is covering these races, presumably voters, even the ones who aren't actively paying attention, might pick up something. And that serves an informational role, which is necessary in democracies. We shouldn't be voting for individuals who we don't know or can't figure out how they would behave. That's one of the problems with nonpartisan elections generally, is because if it isn't well campaigned, we honestly are choosing between 2 people we don't know. Although many people don't. And so here's an interesting circumstance that this article actually brings up. In fact, it's the dependent variable article, but I want to talk about it to some extent. And it's this idea of what is known as ballot roll-off. Ballot roll-off is the phenomenon where individuals vote at the top of the ballot, but roll off, which is simply to say don't vote, lower down on the ballot. So what the dependent variable is in this context is individuals who voted at the top of the ballot, be that for president, senator, governor, whatever the top ballot race was, and voted for a Supreme Court justice. Now, what percentage drop off? That's what ballot roll-off is. And what we know is that ballot roll-off in partisan judicial elections, is the lowest. It's always been the lowest, and it will continue to be the lowest. And the answer for that is why is because there exists a very helpful heuristic that makes voters make an educated choice. They may not know the candidates by name. They may not know really ideologically how they are. But if you have a Democrat versus a Republican, most voters know where they sit in that dichotomy and can choose the candidate who is closest to them based on this party ID. So ballot roll-off is the least in partisan judicial elections. It's less, it increases when you get to nonpartisan elections. And part of that is because of the lack of on-ballot heuristic, that you simply can't identify looking solely at the ballot, which one of these judges is ideologically closer to you. And so we see ballot roll-off go up, sometimes in the double digits, sometimes as high as 20% in nonpartisan races. But there exists contestation. So it doubles the chance that you might know something about one of the 2 candidates, and that can often be enough simply to make a choice. If you know a lot about candidate A but nothing about candidate B, You can make a choice in those circumstances. But then you get to these retention election races. These retention election races is a name and do you approve? Um, these candidates don't campaign themselves most often than not. And outside of the events that happened in Iowa and California, where a well-funded, coordinated effort to get them out of office takes place, likely the average voter doesn't know very much about the judge. And so ballot roll-off increases even more. In the sample in the paper, the highest ballot roll-off occurred in a retention election state, and it was in Indiana, and it was over 40% of the people who voted at the top of the ballot failed to vote in the judicial retention races. Now, can local reporting raise that? Absolutely. That's what the Hughes article is about, is that local reporting can raise these numbers. But we're in an environment where local reporting is drying up and it is being nationalized. Look at the El Paso Times. It's owned by USA Today. While there are local reporters on the ground, that newspaper is filled with national reports that are fed down to it. And so what does this mean about the health of our democracy? Well, the health of our democracy in the state of Texas, at least in terms of judicial elections, is probably all right because we have partisan elections. But in states that have nonpartisan elections and states that have retention elections with ballot roll-off as high as 40%, that doesn't say a lot about the well-functioning of our democracy.